right, welcome back, everyone. We'll get started again in just a moment. I know that was a really short break from the AGM from those that were there, but it's funny because it reminds me of actually being in the in-person conference where you end up talking with people and it's great, and then you're just running from talk to talk like a crazy person. So it's kind of lovely in a way, right? It reminds me of that feeling of being in person, even though we're not. So that's nice. So just a reminder that we do have our next webinar, which is the last webinar in our series from the sort of ill-fated 2020 conference. And it's on Friday, June 25th. And there's more information and the ability to register on our website, which is CSSPE.ca. And Diane has thankfully put that in the chat box. We are recording this webinar, so usually we have you put your questions in the chat box for the speaker to answer at the end. However, if you are okay with being recorded, you can also just turn on your camera and microphone and say it that way. Just want to make sure you know that you're being recorded and you're okay with that. It will be available on our website. All right. We have people in the room, so I'm going to start. So our second speaker today is Craig Agule from Rutgers University. And Craig is going to present his paper, Forgiveness as Turning Off Blame's Lamp. So as a reminder, Craig will speak for about 40 minutes. I have my little signs to try to keep us in that timing. And then we'll do 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. So welcome, Craig, and thanks for giving your talk today.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for having me. I'm excited to give the talk, and I'm excited for the questions. This has been the I guess morning or mid-afternoon talk was fantastic, so I'm hopeful that I can live up to that. In my talk, I've been grappling with the relationship forgiveness has with the reasons that we forgive. And so I think about a time that someone has wronged me, or maybe invite you to think about a time that someone has wronged you, where I later, where you later, were trying to figure out whether to forgive. And of course, in trying to figure that out, it's possible to consider the reasons for forgiveness. So has the wrongdoer apologized? How important is this relationship with the wrongdoer? What is the nature of the wrong at issue? There are lots of reasons like this that at least apparently can support forgiveness, and that there are reasons like this, that there are reasons that can support forgiving, or reasons that we could appeal to in explaining why we forgave, means that forgiveness is articulate. I'm taking that term from Pamela Hieronymi, that there are reasons that can support forgiving means that forgiveness is articulate. But then if forgiveness is articulate, that might seem to make it obligatory. So if in some case an apology gives me good reason to forgive, then it might seem that not forgiving would be acting in contravention of good reason. So it can seem, and some have argued in literature, that articulation is in tension with election, the idea that forgiveness is up to you. So this talk focuses on that tension, and in which arises when we think about whether the reasons to forgive are of the sort to be normatively constraining or binding, and it focuses on the related question about how much the reasons that have to do with forgiveness are up to the person who would forgive. My argument is going to be that forgiveness is both articulate and elective, and we can reconcile those two ex ante commitments when we're careful to think about blame as a reactive attitude and what it consequently means to forgive. So when I give the account of blame and forgiveness, that's the lamp stuff that I was originally framing this with when I started writing. And practically, I'm going to claim that when we're thinking about whether to forgive, in addition to thinking about the wrongdoer and their attitude toward the wrong and the harms that they've caused and that sort of thing, we should be thinking about who we are and who we want to be. So forgiveness is as much about us as it is about the wrongdoer. My plan, just to give you guys a little bit of a roadmap, I'm going to offer reactive attitude notions of blame and forgiveness. Then I'll think about the reasons that we can have to forgive in two different ways. I'll think about fittingness reasons, and then I'll think about favoring reasons. Once I've worked through those two ways of thinking about reasons, I'm going to come back to the case of apology and try to show how with those two, with the lessons of those two examinations in hand, we can make sense of apology cases as both articulate and then elective. And then I want to make very precise toward the end the notion of election that I think we can get. All right. So let me start just by making sure it's clear what I'm talking about when I'm talking about blame and forgiveness. I'm assuming a reactive attitude notion of blame, familiar from Strawson and the mammoth resulting literature. On this account, we blame when we experience resentment at those who wrong us, indignation when we're a third party to the wrong, guilt at our own wrongs. This blame, these reactive attitudes are more than mere dispassionate opprobrium, to use Wallace's fantastic term, R.J. Wallace's fantastic term. So blame is more than just judgment of wrongdoing, but it doesn't require expression. The sort of blame I'm concerned with doesn't require expression, punishment, or other external behavior. Though, of course, we can make motivational connections and the like between the reactive attitudes and the fact that we're inclined toward those things. I'm not in particular arguing for a reactive attitude notion of blame, but I think it's worth noting that Per Erik Milam, who's a skeptic of election, and Lucia Lays, who's an advocate of election, both take reactive attitudes to be the starting point for their arguments. So if that's blame, if that's the reactive attitude notion of blame, what about, oh, sorry. All I've said so far is that I have a reactive attitude notion of blame. I haven't said the things I want to say about it. So what do I think about what a reactive attitude is? So the reactive attitude from Strawson, the reactive attitudes are the class of attitudes that respond to the quality of will expressed in an agent's action. These attitudes have a first component, which is a cognitive or a propositional component. Our blame includes an assessment that the target of our blame is blameworthy. And so when we blame, we take the blameworthy person to have acted in a certain way, and we take that way of acting to be wrong. We don't have to be, I mean, it's good if we're accurate, it's good if we're reflective, it's good if this is conscious, but our blame doesn't have to be accurate, reflective, and conscious. That's just maybe an ideal of sorts. All that's needed here is that our blame includes some kind of assessment that the wrongdoer is blameworthy. Blame, the reactive attitudes of blame also have a characteristic conative element. So this comes out very clearly in George Scher's work, although that's not reactive attitude work. But there we see how blame is associated with the tendency to chastise, to punish, to change relationships. Now, importantly, that's just a characteristic tendency. You can blame without being motivated to act in any particular way in some cases. There are two more elements of the reactive attitudes that are going to be important for my story here. One is that reactive attitudes have a bodily feeling. So think of blame or resentment in particular. There's a characteristic way or set of ways that resentment feels. There's like a tightness and a tension. When you're blaming, you can feel yourself getting ready to go. So your body feels there's a somatic experience of blame. The reactive attitudes, including blame, also have a framing element. As I tell my students often, when you blame, you see the wrongdoer in the light of their wrongdoing. So hence blame has a lamp, right? And I think often here of police procedurals Once the suspect has been nabbed by the police, they're going to be in a room with a lamp illuminating them so that they look culpable, right? They can be the most innocent person you know, your nicest neighbor, but once they're under that lamp, the lamp makes them culpable. And blame works the same way. As David Zimmerman says, the reactive attitudes, they work by shifting your attention from one set of facts to another, and then back over the same set of facts with more care the second time around. And they work by inducing you to see patterns of salience in the facts which you otherwise would have missed. That is, the reactive attitudes dispose you to attend to certain matters, and they dispose you to accept certain interpretations. So these two elements, that blame has a somatic bodily experience and that blame frames your perception, are going to be important to me. Now we can think about forgiveness. Forgiveness involves something like ceasing to blame. And so if blame is a reactive attitude, forgiveness is going to involve ceasing to experience the blaming attitude. And as with blame, here I'm focusing on one kind of forgiveness. There are certainly interpersonal behavioral aspects of forgiveness, and I'm just not addressing those here. They're important. Given the elements of blame that I've laid out, and given that forgiveness is ceasing to blame, what would forgiveness be? Well, we can't ditch that assessment of culpability. As Hieronymy argues, forgiveness is uncompromising. If you decided that the wrongdoer was not culpable, you shouldn't forgive them. You should cease to blame them, but you should cease to blaming them by granting them an excuse or a justification. That's not forgiveness. And I think that makes sense. If you can imagine you do something nice for someone and they mistake what you've done and they're offended. They say, I guess this is me, Craig, how could you have done this to me? And I explain, well, actually, I'm doing you a big favor. And they say, oh, I see, you did do me a big favor. In that case, I forgive you. That would seem misfit, right? So when you forgive, you continue to, you share with the blamer that assessment of culpability. However, you curtail the other elements, the conative, feeling, and framing elements. You no longer have those conative impulses. The feeling of blame dissipates and the framing disappears. There's a third element of forgiveness that's important for me. You must ditch those elements of blame, the conative, feeling, and framing elements, but you must remain otherwise open to the participatory relationship and reactive attitudes. So one way that you might get over blame would be to shift from Strawson's participatory stance to his objective stance, to start treating the person who wronged you like a pet or like a therapist patient, where you're no longer going to be emotionally exercised by them. And if you did that, you'd cease being angry at them, but that wouldn't be forgiving them. That would be closer to letting go. You'd be letting go of your anger by ceasing to care in the relevant way. Forgiveness, by contrast, you continue to be sensitive, emotionally sensitive to how the wrongdoer is acted, with one omission. You're no longer emotionally sensitive to this particular wrong. So that if you forgive someone and they wrong you anew, you are angry anew. And if you forgive someone and they are generous to you, then you can be grateful. So forgiveness requires that you continue to think the wrongdoer was culpable, that you cease the conative, feeling, and framing elements of blame, but that you remain otherwise open to the participatory relationship with the wrongdoer. Okay, so these should be familiar senses of blame and forgiveness. If you think about blaming, imagine someone did wrong. You believe they did wrong as part of your blaming. You want something, you want them to suffer maybe, or you want them to apologize. You can probably imagine feeling the bodily force of the blame. And I invite you to think about what you would think about if you thought about the wrongdoer. And my suspicion is you would then think about the wrong, even if this person was someone with whom you had a rich and complicated relationship, that because of your blaming, thinking of them would prompt you to think about the wrong. And then imagine forgiving. When you forgive, you still believe they did wrong, but if you're successful at forgiving, you're no longer moved by the wrong. You're no longer upset. And you can think of the wrongdoer in the other ways marked by your relationship. So that's the account of blame and forgiveness that I'm working with. So now I want to turn to the relationship between articulation and election, and I want to start thinking about the kinds of reasons that we might have. Here, I'm thinking about work from Darms and Jacobson, and from a different paper from Pamela Hieronymi on trust. And we can distinguish, those papers help us distinguish between fittingness reasons and favoring reasons. And this isn't quite exactly right, but between epistemically warranted reasons and useful reasons. So we all know, or at least I suspect it's true, that 1 + 1 = 2. That 1 + 1 = 2 is a fittingness reason to say 2 in answer to the question, what is 1 + 1? That's a fittingness reason. However, that saying 2 will get you a good grade and thereby get you a plum job is a favoring reason to say 2 in response to the question 1 + 1 = 2. So we can distinguish between fittingness reasons and favoring reasons, and they can come apart. They come apart, for instance, in cases of white lies, right? Where your answer, it isn't a fitting response, but it is favored. Okay, so let's think about fittingness reasons first. If there's a fittingness reason to forgive, maybe that fittingness reason to forgive makes blame irrational and thereby makes forgiveness rationally obligatory. And if forgiveness becomes rationally obligatory, maybe it's even morally obligatory, given that blame imposed costs and we don't like when we're blamed. So Perek Milam has argued that given that blame has fittingness conditions, so plausibly does forgiveness. And if forgiveness is fitting, then it's rationally obligatory. I'm going to accept the former conditional, that if blame has fittingness conditions, so does forgiveness. But I'm going to deny the latter, that if forgiveness is fitting, it's rationally obligatory. Why do I deny that forgiveness being fitting makes it obligatory? Because on my account, forgiveness and blame have the same fittingness conditions. Hence, if the one is epistemically warranted, so does the other. Now, why would that be? Because both of them share the central assessment that the wrongdoer is culpable. That is the epistemically warranted condition for both of them. Thus, there are no reasons that can be reasons of articulation as between them in terms of fittingness, because they both have the same fittingness conditions. Milam's argument assumes that the fittingness conditions are different, but the fact that he is culpable is the fittingness condition for blame and the fittingness condition for forgiveness, which we can see when we notice that the fact that he is not culpable tells us not to blame and also tells us not to forgive. All right, so on my account, blame and forgiveness have the same fittingness conditions, but maybe so much the worse for my account. So one way to read Milam and Hieronymi and work on forgiveness by Miranda Fricker is that there's a difference in fittingness conditions having to do with the wrongdoer's change of heart. This argument goes something like this. Blame and forgiveness share the backward assessment of culpability. Blame also, in addition to that, takes the wrongdoer to continue to endorse the wrong, and forgiveness takes the wrongdoer to have disavowed the wrong. So they both have this core fittingness condition, but then they both have something more, and that something more differs. So the full set of fittingness conditions differs, right? And so on the Milam-Hieronymi-Fricker account, maybe forgiveness is fitting when the wrongdoer has disavowed the wrong, and it's not fitting if they have not disavowed the wrong. Okay, good. One problem with this is that lots of forgiveness seems intuitively reasonable, even if the wrongdoer has not experienced a change of heart. Unconditional forgiveness. You've got someone who's wronged you, and it's, say not a grievous wrong, and you decide you're going to forgive them even though they've not apologized. Now, or imagine forgiving someone who's very far away, so the distant or the dead. It's imaginable to me to forgive the dead, even if you don't have reason to think there's been something like a deathbed confession. My notion of forgiveness, where the fittingness conditions are shared between blame and forgiveness, comfortably captures these phenomena. You can change your feelings without apology, you can change your framing without apology, and you can do that at a distance. So what would Milam, Hieronymy, and Fricker say about unconditional forgiveness in the distant and the dead? They have two answers, and neither of them are particularly satisfactory to me, but I'll give them their sales pitch. So their first answer is to say something, like, well, cases of unconditional forgiveness or forgiveness of the distant or dead are mistaken, are in the wrong. The second thing they say, which I think is closer to what they'd like to say, is that these aren't cases of true or core or paradigmatic forgiveness. These are something like quasi or derivative forgiveness. This is especially explicit in Miranda Fricker's work, but I think Hieronymy takes the case of forgiveness with apology to be the paradigm. So I think it runs through all of them. Still, both of these moves, saying that forgiveness of the unconditional forgiveness and forgiveness of the distant and dead, whether saying that that's mistaken or derivative or quasi, seem a bit revisionary to me. So we'd want to know, why would we accept this further condition? In particular, why should we accept that a change of heart is part of the fittingness or the epistemic warrant for forgiveness, especially given how contentious that assertion is? My sense is, my sense is that for all of them, their argument is tied to the use or the function of blame and forgiveness. This is especially visible in Hieronymy and Fricker. And so because their arguments about the change of heart are really arguments about the usefulness of blame, I'm just going to defer my assessment of those arguments to talk about the reason for kinds of reasons. So just to step back for a second, given my notion of blame and forgiveness, there's at least a prima facie reason to think blame and forgiveness are going to be simultaneously, or something like co-fitting, that they're going to have the same fittingness conditions. With the caveat that the kind of leading challenge to my view is going to ride with talk about the function of blame. So there's a little bit open that I'll have to take up in just a minute. So let me turn to reasons for, the favoring reasons. And here we can imagine, if there is reason in favor of forgiving, maybe that reason obligates us to forgive. One argument that is more apparent in Hieronymy and Fricker and less so in Milam is that blame and forgiveness are practically exclusive. That is, there's a purpose to blame, and at least in some paradigmatic cases, the grounds for forgiveness also immediately bear on the purpose to blame. So for instance, at least, to be more precise, maybe, at least in some cases, the same reason to forgive fully extinguishes the reason to blame. That's the practical exclusion. Where there's a reason to forgive, that excludes there being reason to blame. And then because blame is costly, it's obligatory to forgive because it's costly and there's no reason for it. So for example, if we think of blame's function as moral protest, and if we think an apology shows us not just that there is reason to forgive, but that there is no reason to protest, then if there's no reason to protest, there's no use in blame. And so because blame is costly, we should forgive. If we accept this argument, the sort of practical exclusion argument, then in a case where there is reason to forgive, that is, when we have articulation, continuing to blame would be practically irrational and maybe also prudentially or morally wrong, right? So they have a neat argument from articulation to a real binding force. The problem is this is too parsimonious regarding the uses of blame and forgiveness. Even if blame can protest, it can do so much more. So blame can help us protect ourselves It can help you attend to threats like the one that you've already been victimized by. Blame can help us insulate our mental health. Blame can help us build community. Go to a sports bar and blame the athlete who fails to make the shot. That's surely not a protest against the athlete who's not there. Instead, what you're doing is seeking camaraderie from your neighbors at the bar, right? Blame can also get an apology. So I'm not denying that blame can function as protest, but it can do all these other things besides. Likewise, forgiveness can do lots of things. It can, as Fricker discusses, it can free up your attention and energy from the demands of blame. But forgiveness is also a way of recognizing the value of the relationship. So blame and forgiveness both have lots of good things they can bring about. And it's not surprising that they have lots of good things that they can bring about. When we think back to those framing and feeling elements, we should see that the framing and feeling elements are ways of setting priorities and organizing attention. This should be obvious for the framing element, right? Framing is a way of prioritizing what you're going to pay attention to and which interpretations you're going to be sympathetic to. So framing things is a way of saying this thing or this relationship are important to me, and I want to keep it and its implications at the center of my attention. The feeling, sometimes overlooked in some philosophical writing about blame and forgiveness, the feeling of blame is also important. Feelings are not just ways to kind of alert us that we're in a phenomena. Feelings demand our attention. Imagine trying to get anything done when you're angry, and it's so hard to think about anything other than what you're angry about. And that's not just a downside of anger, that is part of the working of anger. The bodily feelings demand your attention. And if you don't think that's true, I suggest right now, pinch yourself very hard and then also pay careful attention to my talk. And I suspect that the harder you pinch, the less compelling, or maybe more compelling, my points will be. So feelings have this attention commanding effect as well. And so the framing and the feeling are ways of setting your cognitive perceptual priorities. And cognitive and perceptual priorities are all-purpose goods. They can help us stay on task for various ends, help us get them done efficiently. And so it's not surprising that all-purpose goods like framing and feeling can serve a range of ends and not just one particular end, right? So I think there are ranges of goods that blame and forgiveness can serve. So far, I've mentioned really just extrinsic purposes. By attending in certain ways, we enable further effects. But there are also intrinsic goods of attending in certain ways. There's the aesthetic purpose of seeing the world in a certain fashion. As Wallace argues, when we emote, our emotional engagement, which means for me, the framing and feeling, adds meaning to our engagement with the world. So one intrinsic good of blame is that it is a way of taking the wrong seriously. It's a way of saying, this is what I value paying attention to, perhaps for what it gets me, but also just this is what I want to pay attention to. And one good of forgiveness, correspondingly, is that you want to pay attention to other things. These are kinds of aesthetic experiences. What do you want your aesthetic experience to be? And one aesthetic experience is of blame, and the other is of forgiveness. So we've got a bunch of uses of blame and forgiveness, some extrinsic, some intrinsic. Given all of these goods of the practice of blame and forgiveness, we should reject the analytic claim regarding exclusion. That is, because there's some reason to forgive, that does not entail that there's no reason to blame. I suspect that Hieronymy and Fricker are inferring from something like the paradigmatic purpose of the practice of blame to this is the sole good of blame in particular cases. And so given all these uses of blame, we should reject the practical exclusion argument. And so much the worse for this kind of argument, also so much the worse for the fittingness argument that I discussed before. Now, Milam's argument is a little bit different. It's still a reasons for argument, but it's a little bit different. Milam says forgiveness can seem open because there are reasons on both sides, right? So Milam starts where I just wrapped up, saying you can have reasons to blame at the same time you have reasons to forgive. But, says Milam, reasons can add up. And once they add up, there's just one thing you have reason to do. And he argues that's just like anything else, right? You've got pluses and minuses and you do your arithmetic and you get one thing you should do, and there's nothing interesting here. So Milam has a balance of reasons argument that goes from articulation to obligation or non-election. And I have two objections or ways of resisting that balancing argument. The first is that, yes, maybe we should add up the reasons on both sides, but the importance of those reasons can vary from person to person, from circumstance to circumstance. So if we think about the kinds of values at stake in forgiveness, they are very personally variable values. So the value of a relationship is not some objective function of, well, it's a friend I met 7 years ago, so this relationship's worth 9 relationship points or something like that. No, it's much more individual than that. And the value of the relationship can really vary, can be very idiosyncratic. Likewise, the energy involved in blame and forgiveness can really vary from person to person. So even if the factors do add up in the way that, that Milam is suggesting, the summing is going to be highly dependent upon the person who's doing the adding. So maybe there is some right answer for you, but it is going to be a right answer for you, and we'll never get anything like the mere fact of apology mandates forgiveness. So that's one response to the summing up or the balancing argument. I think the stronger response, and I endorse that response, but I want to add to it a stronger response, which is that we sometimes make our values. Sometimes we set our values by our choices such that there's no pre-existing right answer. So this is familiar from Ruth Chang's work on constituting our values. So for instance, when I choose to become a philosopher, certain other things become more valuable to me. It's much more valuable to me to go to a conference, to give a talk once I'm a philosopher than it was beforehand. And my choosing to be a philosopher changed those other values. Likewise, I can choose to become someone's friend. And as soon as I choose to become their friend, their friendship becomes valuable to me, right? So there are ways where we can just make things valuable to us, where such that prior to our choices, it was open how valuable those things are. And I think framing and feeling are the very sorts of things that are involved in those kinds of choices. We are in framing and feeling, we are bringing stuff to the center of our attention. We are deciding, or even if we're not deciding, we're enacting our priorities. And so we can set our values. So two things there. Well, let me sum up the pieces of the puzzle. First, blame and forgiveness are centrally about feeling and framing. This means, second, that blame and forgiveness are all-purpose goods with many ends, including aesthetic ends. Third, the balance of those ends predictably varies a lot from person to person. And fourth, the values of some of those ends are constituted by our actions, including our framing and feeling. So then let's return to the case of apology, which is where the skeptics built their trouble. Remember, the skeptics said, if there's an apology such that it provides reason to forgive, then it makes it obligatory to forgive. Thinking about the factors that could be at play and how apology can change them. So we could think about things like the angst of blame, the ongoing relationship, standing up for yourself. And an apology can change what's at stake descriptively. So one kind of relationship is with someone who has not apologized and continues to endorse mistreating you. And another kind of relationship is with someone who has apologized. So an apology just changes the descriptive facts. And an apology can change the ongoing threat posed by the wrongdoing. So an apology can change the descriptive facts. Importantly also, how those facts matter can vary a lot person to person. So maybe the apology makes the relationship more tempting for everyone, but how tempting it is, even if it's more tempting, can vary dramatically from person to person. After all, right, 2 cents is much more than 1 cent. So more doesn't tell you anything about how objectively valuable something is, or how totally valuable something is. It just says more relatively. So the apology can make something more tempting, but we still don't know how tempting it is, and we need to think about the person who has been apologized to. Likewise, the apology can, we can think about how the apology interacts with the ways that we make our values. The apology could spark an interest in resuming the relationship, right? Not just give you rational prudential reason to resume the relationship, but it could causally spark it, where you say, oh yeah, thinking about the apology caused me to, so it was the reason I forgave, such that it's open whether to care about the continuing relationship. And the apology gave you, you endorse the apology as a reason to care about the continuing relationship. And that means it really is up to us how important it is to focus aesthetically on certain things. That's not fixed by some prior. And then if that's true in the case of apology, we should get the same thing in unconditional forgiveness. There's nothing distinctive about apology. Whether or not anything has changed, it's always possible for the agent to have a normative change, to change what they value. So I could say, just reflecting on things, I committed to valuing the relationship. That makes forgiveness more valuable to me, right? And I might commit to valuing the relationship by forgiving. And so in these cases, we get that forgiveness is articulate because the forgiver can point to the thing that explains why they forgave. But forgiveness is still elective because it's still, in a significant sense, up to the forgiver whether to forgive. Great. And I think this is a very robust sense of election. On my account, it is never epistemically irrational to blame or to forgive where one of the others on the table. That is, they have the same fittingness conditions. And so if the one is epistemically rational, the other is too. So it's elective in that sense. It's also elective in that it's practically sensitive to your values and choices. And it's elective in that whether or not to forgive is open at the point of deciding. That my blaming, if I blame, I thereby focus on certain things and I make those things important to me. If I forgive, I focus on other things and make those things important to me. And since my making important is going to fall out of whether or not I blame or forgive, it remains prior to my blaming and forgiving open what's going to be important. And this is much more than the sense of election that Hieronymy, Fricker, and Milam are forced to. They're often forced to something like, when we say elective, we just mean that the wrongdoer can't demand forgiveness. And so I have not just that the wrongdoer can't demand it, but that it's actually normatively open to the forgiver which way to go. That said, I'm not necessarily claiming that forgiveness is universally elective, meaning in all cases, it's morally open, or normatively open, whether to forgive. Probably it's not universally elective. And that's because we can be obligated to have some priorities. So if you're in a relationship, there's plausibly an obligation to continue to care. There are probably obligations of priority that just come from being human. And so if there are obligations to have priorities, obligations to care, then those are going to constrain the sorts of elections we make. Nonetheless, I think this is essential. Forgiveness is essentially elective because that forgiveness is elective has to do with the essence of blame and forgiveness, with their framing and feeling elements. All right, I'll wrap up and then look forward to questions. So let me step back to the initial puzzle. there seemed to be a tension between articulation and election, a tension between there being reasons to forgive and it being up to you to forgive. And I've argued that we can dissolve that tension once we recognize that blame and forgiveness have a variety of valuable consequences, and that blame and forgiveness are ways of setting priorities. And thus, forgiveness is elective because it's a choice between valuable alternatives, and the values of those are up to the agent. And it's articulate because the agent can point to the valuable alternative that is at the center of their choice. This argument highlights the importance of those framing and feeling elements of blame, and those elements are often underappreciated or left out of discussions of the reactive attitudes. So I want to spark interest in those elements of the reactive attitudes. And my argument has practical significance in that when we talk about the reasons to forgive, of course, we should think about things like whether the wrongdoer has apologized, whether there's an ongoing threat and the like, but we should also think about what sort of person we are and what sort of person we want to be. So we should look inward and not just outward in deciding whether to forgive. That's it. Thanks so much. I hope you've stopped pinching yourself, and I look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Craig. That was great. Really interesting. I love that little part at the end, actually. That was I feel like I want to hear more. So we are going to open it up to questions. So again, you can either put it in the chat box, and you can even put in the chat box, I have a question, because then it creates a speakers list, or you can use your hand emoji, and I will try to stay on top of those. Oh, and I see Sandra. So if you want to unmute. Yes.
Thank you. I can't put my questions in chat because I made a mess of that earlier. Thank you, Craig. Wow, that's a lot to absorb. And it's such an important topic. And I, perhaps like everyone else, am guilty of placing your talk in the context of my interest in the rights of Indigenous peoples. And one of the concerns that I have is that, well, the question that is surrounding the comments I'm going to make, the core of it is, are there some actions that are unforgivable? And I could talk about the whole history of colonialism. I could talk about the intention to kill the Indian and the child. And you know, there's a whole lot of things I could ask about. Parliamentarians have made apologies to Indigenous peoples. And I was told recently that the United Church of Canada in the 80s apologized to Indigenous peoples for their participation in the residential school system. And their apology was heard, but it wasn't accepted. And it strikes me that I don't know if the same reaction would be today, because maybe the United Church has demonstrated by its actions that they meant their apology. But do you think that there are actions for which to ask an apology diminishes the great harm that has been done?
I'm making notes because I think there are three awesome questions here. It sounds like one question is whether some wrongs are unforgivable. Another question is whether it's maybe wrong to either offer or ask for an apology for some wrongs. And then maybe a third question is whether it's right to reject an apology. And here I think I'm more comfortable with my my very personal limited scope abstract theorizing than I don't know I don't know the turf of your expertise as well as I know the kind of space of mine a little bit. So these are tentative. I guess my thought when I think about kind of grievous wrongs that are social in nature like that, one thought is that one of the things that goes on with an apology, with offering an apology, is one thing. If I apologize, one thing I'm doing is I'm saying I'm now doing my own framing and feeling on the wrong, right? So if I apologize, one thing I'm saying is I'm paying attention to the wrong as a wrong. But another thing that can kind of go on is I might be saying, and I'm asking you for you to stop paying attention to the wrong. Like that's what asking for forgiveness is. And so, so then I can imagine, you know, if you've been the victim of some of these serious wrongs, an apology is asking you to pay more attention to me, right? So that can maybe explain some of why the apologies, even if earnest, can fall a little bit short, like, you know, but I'm hesitant to say the wrongs are unforgivable. Instead, I would say something like, well, forgiveness is going to become a lot more appropriate once the reasons for paying attention to the wrong have sort of dissipated. And for those kinds of wrongs, it would just take so much work. You know, you would have to make the wrong maybe uninteresting to the victims of the wrong. And simply apologizing doesn't make the wrong uninteresting to them. So I think in other kind of in development work, I try to connect some of this stuff to thinking about the ethics, the political ethics of attention. Like what should we pay attention to? I am originally from the American South. I grew up with Confederate statues everywhere. I'm sure you all hopefully have not been seen any of that debate, but you know, one way to think about that is something like what obligations of attention, like, you know, I went to the University of Virginia. How should I pay attention to Thomas Jefferson, you know, given that I've benefited in certain ways and not in others? So all of that leads me to say that in theory, nothing's unforgivable. But in practice, it will take a lot of directed remedial attention before forgiveness starts to become tempting. Thank you. That's great. I mean, these circumstances are great question and comment. No, sorry.
I'm noticing there is a question from Philip in the chat box. I don't know, Philip, if you want to also ask it in person. I see, yep, you've appeared.
Yeah, well, thank you for your presentation. I found that very exciting, interesting. It just occurred to me that, on the other hand, what this is in contrast to what Sandra's talking about, a lot of forgiveness is proffered without blame. So somebody might approach you and say, would you forgive me for doing such and such to you? And you say, well, I never even thought of that. Wasn't even aware of it, but I forgive you. No problem. There's no blame. There is forgiveness. And that happens frequently. Or perhaps it just doesn't matter to me. I knew you did something wrong, but I never blamed you for it. It doesn't matter to me. I forgive you, but I never blamed you for doing something wrong to me. If that is true, then to what extent is a lamp metaphor? Metaphors are always dangerous, of course, because they identify something with something it isn't, either explicitly or implicitly. To try to understand something else better, in this case, try to understand forgiveness better by turning blame into a lamp. So I understand where you're coming from, but to what extent is a lamp metaphor helpful in understanding blame and forgiveness?
That's a great question. And it's one that I have trashed many outlines of many papers on forgiveness, trying to get going with that kind of stuff. At the beginning of the talk, one of the things that I kind of casually hid was I'm talking about these emotions and not the other stuff. But that's a kind of cheap move. And in particular, I think forgiveness we use sometimes to mean I forgive you means, sorry, sometimes when we say I forgave him, we mean I ceased to blame him. Like I was angry and then I got over it. And that really has to do with our attitudes. And sometimes when we say I forgave him, we mean I released him from the obligations his wrong created toward me. And you could do one without the other, they can come apart. So I think part of what's going on here is that there's actually different but related phenomena that get called forgiveness. The same as with blame, right? So I can blame you smoldering inside without saying anything, but also if I said, you jerk, it would be appropriate to say the thing I just did was blaming you. So there are, for both blame and forgiveness, internal and interpersonal variants. In my talk, I was really thinking about blame as the internal attitude, and then forgiveness relative to that account of blame. But that's just to kind of stipulate away your question, or to say like, here's the focus of it. I wish I had something much more
What
brilliant.
you're talking about is what I might call emotive forgiveness, not cognitive forgiveness. Maybe that might help. There's a lot of forgiveness is emotive. The issues that Sandra brings up are extremely emotive. But then again, a lot of forgiveness is non-emotive. It's cognitive. I wasn't aware that you had offended me, but if you want my forgiveness, you have it. Or I was aware that you offended me, but you know what? It didn't matter to me one way or the other. But if you want my forgiveness, you have it. So you might think about talking about a particular kind of forgiveness, deeply felt, passionate forgiveness, emotive forgiveness, rather than forgiveness generically.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's right. I want to, in a fuller draft, a paper version, I would say, look, there's lots of things that are forgiveness, and I'm focusing on this one. I want to, so thank you for pushing me on that, but also you're making me think that when I say I wasn't aware of the wrong, but I forgive you, I could be doing two different things. One is an emotive forgiveness kind of thing, and the other is more interpersonal. I could be saying, I wasn't aware, but I forgive you, meaning you don't have to worry about it. That's the interpersonal, releasing you from the obligations you have as the wrongdoer. But I could also be saying, I wasn't aware, but I forgive you, meaning I commit myself to a certain emotional framework. So that,
yeah, but the kind of forgiveness I'm talking about is no emotional framework on the part of the forgiver.
I think that's the first kind. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like I'm abrogating you of some sort of emotional blame.
Yeah.
I didn't blame you in the first place, and don't blame you now.
I think that's
you have it.
I think that's, I come to philosophy from law, and often I'll distinguish between criminal law and tort and say, you wreck someone's car and you might face criminal sanction. You might also face compensatory duties. And so sometimes I'm tempted to say that to really get the sort of forgiveness that I'm talking about, you've got to be closer to the criminal laws. Like, it's not just that you owe me fixing it, but I'm mad about it. Yeah. But we can also forgive. I mean, we can, we forgive loans. And that doesn't mean we say to the, the person who borrowed money, I'm no longer angry at you.
That's right.
Right. So I think, one thing is just my being very careful to say, as you were saying, it's the emotive sense that I'm thinking about, which often comes up in therapeutic context. Should I forgive, right? It's that emotive sense. But then also I want to think about the connections between the emotive sense and say the kind of bigger political questions of, these grievous social wrongs, or even interpersonal connections like the cognitive or say financial forgiveness. So yeah, thanks.
Sandra, I see your hand.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip, for introducing this distinction between emotive and cognitive, which was, of course, in your paper. One of the things as I was listening to you that kind of, triggered a was when you were sort of drawing a kind of hard line between hearing an apology, even feeling that the person was delivering a sincere apology, and embodied in your acceptance was going to be a kind of taking control of your feelings, so that blame was no longer part of your emotive reaction. And I'm thinking that this works in the kind of not too serious wrongdoing that Philip was talking about, or in even more serious wrongs where you may feel that you have been wronged, but all of those other values that you talked about in terms of relation building and all that stuff come in and make it seem to you a prudent thing to do, to forgive. However, if you do that, if you forgive and have, and in such a way that the other person does not believe that you still think what they did was wrong, and you're struggling to bring yourself into a condition where those feelings are gone, then I think that is a bit of a problem maybe for your account, because I think that forgiving is not something that happens in a moment of deciding, okay, it's reasonable for me to forgive this person. Forgiving, if it's tied to a sense of pretty deep on injustice, that is going to take a while. And it also, it goes back to the original question that I asked about the idea of the actions of the person thereafter the apology being consistent with having made it. If I forgive a friend or a husband or whatever for doing something because they've apologized, then 2 weeks later they're doing it again. I'm sorry, guy. You know, this just doesn't cut it. You know, tell me you're a weak man and I may forgive you, but
I think I think that's right. I suspect of course, it's my view, so I want to say it can handle all. I think one of the things that my view helps with is when we think about blame. If we think about blame as mostly motivational, well, then surely you should be able to change your mind about what you want to do, at least sometimes. But the more we think about blame as the way you pay attention, our attention is sort of up to us. So I'm, paying attention to you all, and now I can decide to look at my dog, and now I'm looking at her, and now I can, right? My attention is sort of up to us, but not completely. And so to go back to your first question, it might be harder for me to look away from really terrible wrongs whose effects run through all of my life and all of the lives of those I love. It's hard for me to stop thinking about those, stop paying attention to those. Whereas cut me off in traffic, I can get distracted from that pretty easily. So I think one of the virtues of thinking about forgiveness in terms of framing and feeling is that allows both that you can do something about it, but that it's hard, like, it's not like lifting my hand. If I decide to lift my hand most times, it happens. Whereas as when I was a student, I can tell you that paying attention, when I go to colloquium talks, I'm sure this isn't true of any of you, but when I go to talks, my commitment to attend is not always successful. So I think that framing and feeling can help explain why forgiveness has this process-like element where you're like, I'm trying to change what I attend to, but it's not overnight, and I'm not guaranteed of success. And if you keep wronging me, you're disrupting my trying to look away. So hopefully I've turned an objection into an argument for, but we'll see.
Yeah, actually, you have given an excellent answer to my worry. And I think that perhaps I wasn't attending carefully enough to your words. If I had heard if I had picked up on the idea that you're accepting all of this as a process in time, it doesn't happen in a moment, then I think no problem.
Right, right. Great, great. Yeah.
Craig, there's an article in Volume 1 of the Canadian Journal of Practical Philosophy, co-authored by Jim Guff, on apology and forgiveness. You might want to check that out. Do you recall that, Sandra?
No, I don't recall the title, but all he has to do is check the journal. Also, Trudy Govier at the University of Lethbridge has been doing a lot of work in apologies, and I would highly recommend her work as worthwhile taking a look at as well.
Well, I'll look both those up. Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, well, since we're at time, I would like to thank Craig for his fantastic talk, got us all thinking. So thank you. Yeah, we can do little emoji hands or whatever people are doing.
And if I can thank you all, having this talk, you know, the past year and a half has been so disruptive. And I just, having these things continue forward has been so valuable. I mean, I appreciate these comments, the talk, the opportunity. This has been really great. And I want to thank you guys for keeping it all together. That's impressive.
Thank you. Well, it's so good to hear.
Sorry. Could I just say, I would not be the co-editor of the Canadian Journal of Practical Philosophy if I didn't urge you to remember us when you want to publish.
All right.
Yeah, I guess I just always throw that in somewhere. It's not in my script. I don't have that. But yeah, so thank you so much. And I mean, it's scholars like you who allow us to keep having webinars because it's a distracting year. So it's been hard to get people to pay attention to things like this, but I think it's important that we keep going in so many ways. All right. So thank you to Craig, thank you to Amber for both of these great papers today. Thank you, audience, for coming and attending on a Friday afternoon. That's fantastic. I'd like to thank Diane for organizing the webinar and all the stuff that you're doing behind the scenes, keeping this moving and working. And also just like to throw out a thank you to Andrew and Karina, who isn't here, who organized the original conference that never happened. But we relied on your hard work in order to make the webinar happen. So thank you. Just a reminder, our next webinar is Friday, June 25th, and you can find more information on the website. And a reminder that we are now accepting abstracts, papers, and proposals for our next webinar series, and we hope to see everybody there. So thank you, everyone, and have a great weekend.
Thank you, Melanie.